All right, we are recording. Great. Well, this is Carol Woodbury, and I have worked in the area of IBM iSecurity for way more years than I will ever admit to anyone, but I have really enjoyed doing this series, and I'm privileged to have done the series on security-relevant system values, and now today we'll be talking about object-level security and what your options are for securing your data. So let's just go ahead and get started here. All right, why are we bothering with security? Why have you subscribed to this series? All right, so a lot of times in the past it's just been because my boss told me to, but more and more and more organizations are realizing that we have to pay attention to security because there is data residing on our IBM i systems that's a corporate asset, and it must be secured appropriately. And a lot of times there's regulatory issues surrounding that data that we must comply with. And in the case of a breach that has just occurred that we're all very aware of, the Equifax, in that case, there was a lot of private data, right? So we all want to make sure that we are not the next Equifax headline. So that's why we are bothering with security. All right, so what is the risk? The scope of the risk of not securing your data really depends on the type of data. So again, let's just talk about something very relevant. With Equifax, it is incredibly risky because of all of the PII, or the personally identifiable information that was stored on their systems. Now, you may have a different set of data. You're probably not one of the other two credit bureaus, but you still might have that PII data for perhaps your employees or maybe some for your customers. You might have credit card information if you take credit cards as payment. But the other thing that you need to think about is the type of data that resides on your IBM i system that is unique to your organization and makes your organization you. So if you think of Sony, for example, what makes Sony Sony? Well, some of the intellectual property like movies, right, that have been put up on the dark web for free. So those things that if they were lost or stolen could do damage either to your reputation or to the underlying core business. So you have to consider a lot of different things about what the scope of the risk is, or when you're determining the scope of not securing your data. Okay, so what we'll talk about today, we're going to talk about what your options are for securing objects, those libraries, the files, the directories, and so forth. We will talk about the authority search order, and this is important to understand because if you try to change something and users still have access, it's probably because something else about their configuration is getting them in. So you have to understand what order the IBM i checks the authority in. And then we'll also talk about this thing called adopted authority. So let's go a little bit further. All right, so if you listen to my session on IBM i security relevant system values, I showed you this presentation with this chart, and in that case, the system value was highlighted. When I describe IBM iSecurity, I talk about it in terms of there being three distinct features that must be in balance. Like a three-legged stool, you want all of the legs to be the same length so you don't topple over. So the third leg of this triangle is what we're talking about today, and that's object authorities. The other two are the way your system values are set and the way your user profiles have been configured, meaning what are their special authorities, what are their group assignments, and so forth. So the third component of this algorithm is really what are the object authorities set to? How are the users getting access to the data? Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to explain today was really where authority is checked. So one of the reasons why IBM I security is so robust is actually where the authority is checked. So if we start from the bottom up, we start with the hardware. So it's RISC-based hardware. And then there's a layer of code that runs right on top of that hardware, and it's called SLIC, System Licensed Internal Code. And only the operating system can call into this layer of software. We, as an application provider at Help Systems, cannot call into that. Our interfaces are limited to calling either commands or APIs, and those are the things that have been defined at that operating system layer. So there is a distinct boundary between the operating system layer and that SLIC layer. And again, only the operating system can call into that layer. So one of the things that happens is at that SLIC layer, that's where the machine instructions run, so sometimes called MI, or machine instructions. Part of the architecture of each machine instruction is what authority the process running that machine instruction has to have in order to successfully run. So that check is done down at that SLIC layer. So you can see it would be incredibly difficult to replace that piece of code with one of your own or somehow bypass that, because all of the things that we do from an application layer actually translates down eventually into that machine layer, which is the MI instructions. So everything we do actually occurs through one of these MI instructions. So it's constantly being checked to make sure that however we're running has enough authority to do what we're asking the operating system to do. So it's a very robust set of architecture. All right, one too far. So how do I get access, authority to access an object? So again, whatever we're doing, we have to have sufficient authority, because that's what the operating system is requiring. So we can get our authority from a number of different areas, and one of them is from all object special authority. That was discussed in an earlier presentation. That's a privilege that is given at the user profile level. We can give, or we can have authority through something called an explicit or a private authority that's been granted to the object. We can get it through this thing called an authorization list. We can get it through this default authority, which is called public authority, or we could get it through adopted authority. So let's go through that in more detail. Okay, so these are the authorities that have been architected by the operating system and are available for us to assign to an object. Now, whether it's an object in a library or a directory, these are the authorities that are assigned. They're called something different when you're talking about the IFS, but under the covers, all of those authorities, even though they're called something different, actually have these authorities assigned to them. So most of us just deal with the authorities, and I'll call them the shortcut authorities of all, change, use, and exclude, but under those shortcuts, there's actually all of these very individual authorities. So because you're going to get these handouts, if you suffer from insomnia, what you can do is look at the definitions of each one of these, as I have included those in this presentation deck. But when you think about it, a lot of times people are like, well, what's the difference between these object authorities and the data authorities? So the object authorities are authorities that allow you to operate on the object as a whole. So things like object management allows you to grant somebody else authority to the object. Object existence, for example, allows you to delete the object. Then if you think of data authorities, the best context is to describe them in the context of a database file. So if I have read to the database file, I can read the records in the database file, or I can add a record, update a record, and so forth. So object authorities deals with the whole thing, and the data authorities in general deals with the contents of the object. Then there's this authority called exclude, and not all operating systems have this type of authority. Sometimes some operating systems have it, including like Unix and Linux, they don't have an equivalent authority. It's the absence of authority that prevents you from getting to an object. But in IBM I, you have to have some authority, including this thing called exclude. And if you grant exclude to a user, that user will no longer be able to access that object. So you will always have some authority, even this authority called exclude. Okay, so again, I have laid out each one of the individual authorities and explained what each one of them does for you, so you can read that later. Okay, so let's get into the ways that you can get one of these authorities. So all object special authority, and again, that I'm sure has been explained in a previous session, but all object is that special authority or a capability that's assigned at the user profile level. And you'll see later that all object is the first thing that's checked in the authority checking algorithm, and that's why it's so important, because there's no other process that will allow you to prevent access to a user that has all object special authority. So it's kind of the crown jewels, or you're making somebody a king or queen of the system when you have given them all object. The next opportunity that you have to secure objects is to grant somebody, either a user or a group profile, a private authority. Okay, so if I use either the grant object authority command or or edit object authority, in this case, I'm giving John, the user, use authority to the receivables file. Okay, so I have granted that user authority to use the file. So I can either grant it or I can revoke it. And I can do that also with the edit object authority command. So this is just a representation of that, of the edit object authority command. And I also want to make sure that you understand that you can do this type of authority management, not just through green screen, but also through the GUI interfaces provided by IBM. So this is an example of setting authority on an object using the web version Navigator for I. So again, not just a green screen function, but it can be managed through Navigator for I as well. All right, so we just clicked on permissions, and this is the GUI, really basically the GUI version of edit object authority. So if you are still using the client version of Client Access, and you're still using Navigator for I, once again, I would just wanted to let you know that you can manage your security settings using that interface as well. All right, so that's how you would grant a specific authority to an individual or to a group to an individual object. Now, that's all well and good, but a lot of times you are having to apply the same authority to multiple objects for the same users. So, for example, in this case, we have an accounts receivable application, and every month a new file called whatever the month is, -receivables, is created. Now, there are a set of users that need access to these same files. So what I could do is go through and each month grant the authority to each one of these profiles individually. Or what I could do instead is create this thing called an authorization list. And then I am going to attach that authorization list to the file as it gets created. The second step to that then is to grant authorities to the authorization list. Now, by virtue of actually granting the authority to the list, and because a list is attached to the file, Now the effect is that Aaron T. has change authority to each one of these individual authorization lists, or I'm sorry, to each one of these files. So obviously it's September, so now the April, May, June, July, August, September files have been created. I've attached the authorization list to each one of those files. So again, Aaron T. has change authority to each one of these files. Now it hasn't actually been granted individually to the file. It stays on this list, but you'll see in the authority checking algorithm where this authorization list comes into play. All right, so again, you can grant the authorities to each individual object, but a shortcut, a way that IBM has allowed us to more easily manage these authorities is to grant the authority to the list and attach the list to the object, okay? So you might recognize some of these are end users. I have a group profile. I have some what a lot of people call service accounts. So any type of profile can go on this authorization list, all right? One of the other things that we do, especially when we're doing, I lead up the professional services group, the team leader for that group. And so when we go in and help people rework their security scheme, one of the things that we always recommend is that when you're securing files and you're reworking the authority on files, you secure that with an authorization list. And the reason we do that is because if a file is open, in other words, if it's in use, you cannot grant authority. You can't change the authority. You can't change the public authority. You can't grant authority individually or to groups to a file that's open. But if an authorization list is attached to it, you can change the authority on the authorization list, and it will have an immediate effect the next time the file is opened. So you don't have to bring down your applications to change your authority on your files. You can just manage that through your authorization list. So it's a much easier way to manage those authorities. It also allows you to recover in case you have forgotten to add somebody to have access to the file, or perhaps you have a new service account, a new process that comes online. Much easier to manage those authorities by granting them to the authorization list than to attempt to do that to individual files. Okay, so the way that you manage authorities to the authorization list, again, you would create the authorization list, and then you can use edit auth list to add or remove authorities to and from the list. And then if you want to, you can display, there are times when you would want to know what is attached to the list. And so if I'm going to back up one screen, if you take a look, F11 says display detail, nope, not detail object authorities. We want more keys, and it will allow you to display the authorization list objects. My apologies, I don't remember the exact function key, but it is on that previous screen. So here is a list of the objects secured with that authorization list. Again, you can do this through Navigator for I. So again, here's the GUI interface for that. You would click on the secured objects link there, and that will bring up the list of objects secured by that authorization list. Now, the other thing that you might consider doing is using a view. And if you're not familiar with the views that come in QSYS 2 library, these are views that, if you know the IBMer, Scott Forsty, he has done a lot in the database world, bringing us these views that allow us to have very quick and immediate views into a lot of configuration options for IBM I. So you can actually look at who's authorized to an authorization list as well as the objects secured by an authorization list using these views. So that function is available in V7R2 and V7R3, and here is a link to the Developer Works page where these are described. Again, these handouts will be sent with the follow-on email, so you don't have to worry about attempting to write down this URL. Okay, so if I have used this view and I'm using the Run SQL Scripts feature out of the Access Client Solutions client, and I was very easily able to list the information or the objects secured by my AR authorization list. Okay, and again, you can do this through iNavigator. And the object secured. Okay, so I will often get asked which is better, an authorization list or a group profile. And it is not that one is better than the other. Both have been given to us by IBM to allow us to manage, more easily manage some aspect of security. So the authorization lists allow us to more easily manage objects that are going to be secured the same. And group profiles allow us to manage users that have the same requirements. So again, it's not that one is better or worse. You just want to use one. You use a group profile when I want to authorize or have the same, say, special authorities for a set of users, and when I want to authorize a set of objects the same, I'm going to use an authorization list. And I will often grant a group profile authority to an authorization list, so you can combine them. So you use the one that makes the most sense for whatever it is that you're trying to do. So again, one is not better than the other. Okay, so we've talked about all object, being able to get authority from all object special authority. We've talked about giving a private or individual authority directly on the object. We've talked about an authorization list. What we haven't talked about is the default access. So this default access is called public authority. And every object has a public authority. Every object has a default access. It might be exclude, but every object has a default access. So where is that authority coming from? How is that set? Well, it's set when you create the object. And it's set based on the AUT parameter of whatever object you're trying to create. You can set it to all, change, use, or exclude when you create the object, but if you don't do anything, it defaults to this value called live create authority. So what on earth is that? Well, if you go and look at the authority of the description of a library where you're going to create the object into, there is a parameter called create authority, and that will default to sysval. But that's what your value, when you're creating an object, this live create out is actually pointing to this create authority at the library level. Well, since the library is saying sysval, it's obviously pointing to a system value. So I talked a little bit about this when I did my system value presentation. The QCreate.system value is what the value of that is what the eventual value of your public authority value of your objects is going to be set to. So IBM ships this value at start change. So if we go backwards, okay, so create authority was pointing to sysval. It says start change. My object I'm creating, that public authority setting said live create. So up the tree, yep, that's why most objects on the system are now public change. So if you change the system value, there are some things that you have to watch out for. And here are some caveats to that. When you change the system value, it changes the public authority setting for every object created from then on. So it's not going to do anything to existing objects. It has no effect on the public authority of directories. Okay, so I've been talking about libraries on purpose. It has nothing to do with directories. Public authority setting on objects in a directory typically, not always, but typically come from the public authority of the directory being created into. Never looks at the QCreate@system value. Before you change the system value, you will want to make sure that you understand the side effects before you change something. You may actually want to do a combination of changing the system value and changing the value, the create authority value at the library level. So again, when we're doing a professional security services engagement and someone has set their create value to all and wants to get that down to a more restrictive value, we go through some investigation and look at what's being created into various libraries, and we'll usually come up with a combination of changing the system value and changing some of the create authority values at the libraries. Okay, one thing I need to add to my agenda here is this thing called row and column access control. So that is a new feature of V7R2, commonly called as RCAC, row and column access control. This is a technique that you use, and it's a feature of SQL, and it's only managed and applied through SQL. There is no green screen command for this. But at the row level, you can put on an SQL permission that will say that certain users can see certain rows and other users cannot. So you can very distinctly say who can see the contents of each row. So things like if you are running a hospital and you have a patient and I'm a doctor, then I should only be able to see the information about my patients. So one of the permissions could be that if I am signed on as Dr. Woodbury, I can see patients where the field value is CJW or something like that. So again, it will allow you to distinguish who is going to see the rows of a particular database file. The other one is based on the column. And based on a column, you can mask the contents of a column. Now this is not encryption. The underlying database stays with the original data, so that it's only when the value is being retrieved and viewed is the value masked. And again, it is a simple mask, nothing to do with encryption, okay? So let's look at that in a little bit. Oh, I guess I did not provide any more detail. So one of the ways that you could do the column information and mask that, maybe you don't do anything with this on production, but think about it if you have a development system and your developers need live production data to test with or to debug with, but your auditors are demanding that they not use real data. Well, what do? Well, the best thing is to depersonalize or obfuscate the data. But if you don't have the opportunity to do that, maybe you put on some column level permissions that will mask the contents of the column when they're read. So you could think of doing that for things like bank account numbers or social security numbers or social insurance numbers, depending on where you're located and so forth. So there's quite a few different ways that you can use both the row and the column access control settings. Okay, so let's move on. So there's this other method of access, and it's called adopted authority. Now, adopted authority allows you to give access to someone, but not actually give it to them on a permanent basis. It's session-based. Actually, it's stack-based, because adopted authority is enabled through an attribute of a program. So an attribute of a program that allows you to, when the program runs, allows the user running the program to use the authority of the owner of the program. So as long as that program is active, in other words, as long as that program is in the call stack, the adopted authority is available for the process to use. So let's look at a little bit more detail. So one of the things that you have to make sure of is that you understand which attribute of the program actually causes the program to adopt. And it's kind of bad terminology. It is actually not the one that's called use adopted authority. It's actually the attribute called user profile. So by default, that attribute will be set to star user, but in this case, I've changed it to be star owner. And in this case, so when the program in this case runs, this menu option runs, it says user profile star owner. So because this program is owned by QSecOffer, as long as this program is active in the call stack, whoever has invoked this program has the authority of QSecOffer. When the program ends, the authority goes away. So it's very temporary, but it can be used in a variety of ways, again, so that I don't have to permanently grant authority to my users to access either database files or to run a command and so forth. So here's an example. We have program A. So let's say that menu option 1 is actually calling program A. So the owner of this program is called app owner, and it's been configured to adopt authority. So it says user profile star owner. So when I go to actually take the menu option 1, what menu option 1 is doing is, let's say it's, for example, adding a new account. So to add a new account, I would need to change a file, right? I'm adding a record. Well, to add a record to a file, I'm going to need change authority to that file. You can see by the green box that the public authority of the file is exclude. So if I just would normally take menu option 1 and try to add a record to the file, if my program that I'm calling did not adopt authority, I wouldn't be able to add that record. I'd get one of those not authorized messages. But because program A is adopting authority, and let's look at the owner. The owner is app_owner. Who owns the file? Wow, okay, the last line of that green box says file is owned by app owner. So if you own something, by default, you have all authority to it. So I am actually invoking a program owned by a profile that also owns my file that I'm trying to update. So because of the adopted authority, I will have authority to update that file. Now again, if I try to update that file without calling this program, what's going to happen? Not authorized. But because I'm using this program, I can do what I need to do. Okay, so I said that the adopted authority is stack-based, so I actually get an accumulative effect if I call a different program that's owned by a different owner. So program A calls program B. Program B happens to be owned by QSecOffer. That's interesting. And it is set to adopt authority, user profile star owner. So when I try to do something through program B, my authorities are checked. If they're not sufficient, app owner is checked. And if that's not sufficient, well, program B is owned by QSecOffer and it's adopting, so I can do whatever I want to. Which kind of brings me to my next point. There may be times when you don't want the adopted authority used. Say we're putting up a command line. So a lot of times people will have a command line option in a menu. I know that we do in a lot of our program products at Help Systems. We have F21 that pops up a command line. Well, if that product happens to adopt authority, we sure don't want that adopted authority to pop out to that command line. So what we're going to do is wrap that function key and that command call in a program that is configured to say user profile star user, so the program itself doesn't adopt, plus we're going to set the attribute called use adopted authority, And instead of saying yes, it's going to say no. So even though the programs that were called previously adopt, we are stopping the adopted authority and are not going to use it. So that's where the use adopted authority attribute comes in. So again, there's definitely situations where you want to make sure it's the user's authority that is in effect and nothing else. So that's where you take the time and say use adopted authority no. The default is yes. So you have to make sure that you have compiled that program to say use adopted authority no. So that's how that works. Okay, so let's get into the authority search order. So here's the authority search order. Say that I'm trying to open that file for update again. I need to take menu option 1, and menu option 1 allows me to add a new account. So I have to have change authority to a file. So what is IBM I going to do when I take menu option 1? Well, the first thing it looks at is my user profile. So if the profile CJW has all object special authority, I can do whatever I want, right? I have all authority to every object on the system, so that means I have all authority to the file I'm trying to update. Not a problem. The menu option continues, I can do what I want. Now, if CJW has not been granted all object special authority, the next thing the system looks for is to see if CJW has been granted a private authority to the database file. So if I have change authority or greater to the database file I'm trying to update, my task will go on. It will be just fine. But if I have use or exclude to the file, then everything comes to a screeching halt, and I will get one of those not authorized to file XXX in library YYY. So the message here is if I find at the user level, if I find some authority, whether it's sufficient or not, I stop. Okay, so again, if I have sufficient authority, I'll be able to go on. If I don't have enough authority, so in my case, in the example we're doing, if I have use or exclude, again, it's going to come to a screeching halt. And the algorithm stops. It does not go on to the group. It does not go on to public authority. Now, hang on, and I'll explain where adopted authority comes in just a minute. But without the context of adopted authority, that's exactly what happens. Okay, so I don't have all object. I have not been granted a private authority to the database file I'm trying to update. So the next thing the system does is to look at the file to see if it's been secured with an authorization list. So if it has an authorization list, it looks to see if I have any authority to it. Have I been granted a private authority to the authorization list? So once again, if CJW has change or all to the list, I can do what I need to do. I can add that new account. If I have exclude or use, I'm not authorized, and the algorithm stops, and I get the not authorized to file blah, blah, and library YY. Okay, so that's the user level. Stops if any authority is found sufficient or not. Next up, so I don't have all object. I have not been granted a private authority to the object, and I have not been granted a private authority to the authorization list securing the object. So the next thing the system is going to do is to see if I have any group or groups assigned to my user profile. And it basically runs the same algorithm. Does the group have all object? Does the group have primary group authority? And I didn't explain that. Primary group authority is basically a private authority that can only be given to group profiles. So very, very, very rarely used, so I just don't take the time to explain it, but think of it as a private authority only given to group profiles. So it will look at your first group profile, the one that's defined in the group profile parameter in your user profile, and it will look to see if that group has all object. If it doesn't have all object, it will look to see if it has this primary group authority. If it doesn't have that, it will look to see if it has a private authority, and then it will look to see if the group has been granted authority to the authorization list. Now, the thing that makes it different than the user level is that if you have more than one group, it actually walks your group list. So it will start with the group profile, and then it goes on to the supplemental group list. And the algorithm will loop through that group list until it finds sufficient authority or it runs out of groups. So if your third group in has all object, then not a problem. You gain access. Now, the interesting thing is that if one of your groups is excluded from the file, but another one has either change authority or, again, all object, yeah, it actually overrides that exclude, and you gain access to that file. That's kind of a strange happening, but honestly, in all of my years, and again, I've worked in IBM iSecurity for way many years than I'm going to admit, I've never actually seen that to be a problem, but that's actually how the algorithm works. Okay, so we've talked about the user level. If no authority is found at the user level, it will go on to the group. If you have multiple groups, it loops through the group lists until you run out of groups or it finds sufficient authority. So if nothing was found at the user level and nothing was found at the group level, now you come on and hit the public authority. Okay, the public authority can come from one of two places. It can come from either the object itself, or if the object is secured with an authorization list, it can come from the authorization list. It can't come from both, it's one or the other. So again, it will check to see if there's sufficient authority, and if there is, fine, you can add that new account. If there isn't, then you get the not authorized message. Okay, enter adopted authority. So remember I said I was taking menu option 1, I'm trying to add a new account, and I have no authority. I don't have all object, my group doesn't have authority, and public is exclude. So without adopted authority, I would be getting the not authorized message. But the menu option that I chose was actually run a program, and a program that adopts. So what the operating system will do is take that user section, and it will run that section of the algorithm for the owner of the program that I'm running. So if you recall, the owner of that menu option was app_owner. So it will check app_owner's user profile for all object, a private authority to the authorization list, private authority and private authority to the authorization list. So because it's owning the object, it comes under that private authority section, and it will gain access. Now, if app_owner had a group profile, for example, that's ignored. It will only run the user section of the owner of the program. Okay, so that's the way that works. I put row and column access control on this list because you first have to have authority to the object to be able to have any one of those permissions that have been put on the file kick in. So you must first have authority to the database file itself, and then the row and column access control permissions are evaluated. So that's the way that works. All right, so a lot of people ask where we get information on security best practices. So this kind of applies to not just this section on object level security, but it certainly applies to all of the things that we've been talking about in this Getting Started with IBM iSecurity series. So I just like to put up where we all get our security standards and requirements from. So there's some references for you there. And again, if you have questions, it would be best if you could put those in the Q&A box, and that way I'll be getting to questions in just a second here, but if you could put them in Q&A rather than chat, it's easier to determine who actually ask the question in case I don't get to all of them. Okay, and before as you're typing in your questions, I just wanted to give a brief commercial for our Help Systems IBM Marketplace survey. So this is a survey we've been doing for a couple of years now. It's really interesting. IBM actually uses the results of the survey for various things, and in a lot of their presentations, they'll refer to it. So if you would like to be a part of that survey, here is the URL to do so. So this one, unfortunately, this slide did not make my handouts. So you might want to write really quickly there. And actually, I'll leave it up while I go and look at the Q&A box. So let's see, to return here.